So hello and welcome everybody to this February 2020 session of the IVADO webinars. My name is Fabien Perrineau. I am an industrial partnership advisor at IVADO, and today myself and my colleague Lilia Gemai will be your hosts and moderators. So before we start, a couple of housekeeping rules. The microphones and cameras of all attendees will be turned off for the whole duration of this webinar. However, should you have any questions to ask the speaker today, you can use the Q&A button to type in your questions in Zoom, or for those of you following us on YouTube, you can use the chat. All the questions will be addressed during the Q&A session, which will take place right after the presentation. And this webinar will be recorded and then will be available afterwards. So today's topic will focus on social media and innovation in the enterprise. So recent studies show that the use of social media platform is a pretty common practice in companies. It is used in about 80% of them. I guess it won't be no surprise to you if I tell you that social media I recognize as a transformative technology for companies. Increased connections between employees, better accessibility to information, easier collaborations are among the benefits. But what are the impact on the company's strategy and objectives? Is there a way to make this tangible or a way to get some sort of measurements? So today we have the pleasure to welcome Professor Wiestke Van Osh, who will show us how machine learning and natural language processing can prove useful tools in giving insights about measuring creativity and knowledge sharing from the data generated by social media platforms in the enterprise. Wiestke Van Osh is an associate professor at the Department of Information Technology at HEC Montréal. She received her PhD in economics from the University of Amsterdam's Business School. Her research interests focus on digital transformation and enterprise social media. And she has several collaborations with industry partners, including Steelcase and Leo Burnett. Her research work appeared in the Journal of Management Information Systems, the Journal of Information Technology, Information Management, as well as in leading conferences, including the International Conference on Information Systems. She has received the funding from the National Science Foundation, including a prestigious Career Award, as well as funding from industry for her research on social media. So hello, Professor Van Osh. It is a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
So I guess you can.
Yes, I will go ahead and share
the control of the screen sharing now.
Perfect. I hope it's all visible. So thank you very much for the introduction. As Fabienne already said, today I would like to explore with you how we can use data from social media platforms in organizational settings, not only to measure complex behavioral dynamics of organizational teams, but also see if we can use that data to optimize the ability of these teams to engage in collaboration, knowledge sharing, and innovation. So Fabienne already introduced me, so I guess I can sort of skip over this slide, but I just also want to say on this slide that I want to thank all the corporate partners that have made this research possible, as well as the various funding agencies that have provided generous support for this research, including the US National Science Foundation, IVADO, and HEC. And I've also included some contact details here if you would like to connect with me after this presentation, and those will be repeated on the final slide as well. Before discussing my research findings, just a little bit of background to set the stage, and Fabienne already gave some of these insights. In recent years, we have witnessed the proliferation of social media technologies in organizational settings. And according to industry analysts and the business press, these social media technologies provide one of the most transformative technologies for organizations today. And the reason for that is because they promise to break down knowledge silos in the organization and therewith help to boost interaction, collaboration, and co-creation throughout the entire enterprise. As Fabienne mentioned, 4 out of 5 companies, about 80% of organizations today use some form of enterprise social media. However, many organizations are struggling to figure out how these platforms contribute to their bottom line and how to measure the extent to which these platforms indeed have an impact on collaboration and co-creation. Hence, this provided the impetus for this research. And I think the current circumstances with COVID-19 and the pandemic that we experienced, and the fact that organizations have had to pivot to fully digital workplaces almost overnight, makes this research even more important for us to set out to explore how digital tools such as enterprise social media can help to recreate productive and creative dynamics in a completely virtual space. Before going into detail into exploring this question with you, I first want to briefly define enterprise social media for those of you who might not be familiar with these platforms. So if we look at the literature, enterprise social media are defined as web-based platforms that allow employees to engage in 4 sets of activities. The first activity is referred to as communication. And in this sense, enterprise social media is really unique compared to previous forms of computer-mediated communication in the workplace, because it doesn't just allow us to send message privately or to target a particular audience, but also it allows anyone to broadcast messages to the entire organization, so to everyone else in the company. Another characteristic that enterprise social media allows us to do, similar to Facebook and other social media platforms, is that we can connect with coworkers. We can build networks and maintain these networks through these platforms. And this also allows us to reveal who our communication partners or collaborators are to other employees in the organization. A third activity is that it allows us not just to post content, but also to edit content, not just content created by ourselves, but also content created by others, which over time should allow for the optimization or improvement of knowledge and content generated in the context of the platform. And we also can connect content to each other through links. So that means that we don't just have a platform in which there are networks of people relationships, but also networks of pieces of content and text that are linked together. And finally, when content is created in the context of this platform, it is archived eternally. So that means that content can be accessed at any time in the future and persists for other people to use whenever it might be convenient for them. So based on this definition, existing research has proposed that enterprise social media has 4 affordances. Now, I don't want to go over these 4 affordances today, but I just want to highlight that visibility has been marked as sort of the most distinctive and important affordance of enterprise social media. One of the reasons the literature emphasizes it is so important is because, as I mentioned, compared to previous forms of computer-mediated communication for the workplace, enterprise social media are the first tools in organizational history that give anyone in the organization the ability to broadcast messages throughout the company. But in my own research, I have explored another aspect of visibility that is not often discussed in the literature, and that is that with visibility comes also the reverse, namely invisibility. So when people create spaces or groups in the context of enterprise social media platforms, they have the ability to decide if these groups are going to be open, that is visible for the entire organization to see, or closed, that means hidden from the rest of the organization. And we'll see when I start to discuss my research findings why this dynamic is particularly important in the context of knowledge sharing and innovation. So in order to be able to assess the organizational impacts of these platforms for creativity, knowledge sharing, and other types of complex behavioral dynamics in organization, I have been collaborating with Steelcase for the past 9 years. For those of you who are not familiar or less familiar with Steelcase, Steelcase is a multinational organization that provides research, consulting, and manufacturing in the domain of office space solutions. They're headquartered in Grand Rapids, Michigan in the United States, and they have about 11,000 employees across 80 locations in 40 countries worldwide. In the spring of 2012, they launched an enterprise social media system that was based on the Jive platform, which at the time, Jive was probably the most popular provider of enterprise social media solutions, with some of its clients including the World Bank, T-Mobile, and HP. Within just mere months of launching this tool, a lot of people started using it. So about 10,000 employees had active accounts. There were 1,500 group spaces that were created, 800 live projects, and about an 85% engagement rate. For senior management, when implementing this platform, they identified 3 high-level strategic objectives that they wanted to achieve through the use of this platform. And they refer to these as connect, content, and collaborate. The first strategic objective, Connect, was all about leveraging this platform in order to establish a shared culture and identity for the organization. Now, this is a challenge for any multinational organization, but for Steelcase, this challenge might have been a little bit more pertinent because their global expansion over time had occurred largely through mergers and acquisitions. That meant that people might have been one day part of company X, and all of a sudden the next day they're part of Steelcase, but they don't necessarily feel a part of the Steelcase family. So could this platform be leveraged to create more of a shared community feeling? And related to that, the organization also wanted to see if the platform could play a role in breaking corporate restructures. What did they mean by this? Well, large organizations like Steelcase tend to be very headquarter-centric, which means that traditional channels of communication, such as the newsletter, often highlight activities or projects or success stories from headquarters, but tends to ignore or overlook activities that happen in more remote geographic locations or perhaps in settings that are less visible, such as the manufacturing plants. So what senior management was hoping to achieve with this platform is that people anywhere in the organization could share their stories and their successes and their activities so they could gain more visibility and feel more connected to the company. The second strategic objective they refer to as content, and this was exploring if the platform could be used as a vehicle to improve knowledge sharing, and specifically knowledge sharing across organizational boundaries, or what we call in the literature, the organization science literature, boundary spanning. And I'll briefly revisit this concept in a few slides. The third concept or strategic objective, Collaborate, was all about exploring if this platform could be used in order to promote collaborative innovation through a type of internal crowdsourcing where anyone in the organization had the ability to provide and submit ideas through the platform. So in order to help Steelcase and to collaborate towards figuring out a way to assess these three strategic objectives, we began this shared journey where we really commenced with fundamental research, taking a theory-driven approach where we looked at existing research to see how we could conceptualize or define these three strategic objectives of connect, content, and collaborate, and then move from this theory to measurements. How can we use the data generated within these platforms in order to assess and measure these three strategic objectives? And finally, if we're able to measure these effectively, are there opportunities for us to build a dashboard so we can visualize how these behaviors evolve in the social media community in near real time so that they could become something for senior management to refer to and to possibly manage? So let's zoom in on each of these three strategic objectives in turn. So for the first objective, connect. Now, connect was a little bit of a challenge because it's very much a subjective perception, right? Do you feel connected to the organization? Do you feel a part of the Steelcase family? So in the initial stages, we decided to start this project with a set of interviews where we interviewed people from all throughout the organization, different geographic locations, different functionalities. And we felt this would give us an initial glimpse into how people were using the platform, what their perceptions were of the platform, but could also help us get a better understanding before we explored these more complicated strategic objectives such as boundary spanning and creativity and innovation. So the findings from our interviews revealed some interesting themes. For one, people really emphasized that yes, the tool did improve what we call in the literature social capital formation. So the ability of people to build networks and maintain networks of relationships with others in the organization. And in this context, people emphasized that really enterprise social media was like a corporate yellow pages on steroids, where it was much easier to identify experts and to identify people in the organization with similar interests or complementary areas of expertise. Another thing that was mentioned in this context was the ability to perform a background check. And on the next slide, I'll show a quote from a participant that can help to illustrate what was meant by this. We also found that in line with the goal of senior management, the platform did help to improve feelings of connectedness. And in this context, one functionality was particularly important, namely the fact that people could share rich content, photos or videos. In traditional forms of computer-mediated communication for the enterprise, let's say email, you're very unlikely to send a video or a large set of photos because it will take up too much space and you might not even be able to transmit it. But the beauty of this platform was that anyone in the organization could share this type of rich content and therewith offer a glimpse into what was going on in their location or even in the manufacturing plants to people that were largely unfamiliar with processes happening there. So it really, in that sense, did allow anyone in the organization a voice, and it helps to break down core periphery structures. And our interviewers even emphasized that it had sort of a democratizing effect on the workplace. So as you see from this quote, people emphasize that it allowed people to really get to know people from different parts of the organization and to improve the ramp up. It gives them a quick, easy way to look at someone's profile, learn about them, learn about their background, maybe even in the days leading up to a project, get a sense of who you are. So this is where that concept of background check came in, that many people indicated that if they were going to meet someone for the first time or work on a project with someone they had never worked before, they really felt that the platform gave them the ability to kind of get to know them before they started working together, and therefore it allowed the formation of relationships to be a lot easier. And the other quote, as I said, people emphasized that it really allowed them to connect with people above and below them in ways that they couldn't do before. And in that sense, it had this democratizing effect of connecting employees, not just across the different locations of Steelcase, but even across the different hierarchical levels of the organization. So that was it from a very subjective level. And in the latter part of the presentation, where I talk about the dashboard development, I will show you how we also came up with some more objective ways, or let's say metrical ways, to assess the extent to which people felt connected to the organization. For the second strategic objective, content, so this was all about fostering knowledge sharing and boundary spanning. Now, what is boundary spanning? Boundary spanning is probably one of the most pressing challenges in the field of knowledge management, because it's focused on how can we overcome knowledge silos in the organization in order to facilitate efficient and effective knowledge transfer. So boundary spanning is really about communication, linking teams or units in the organization to resources outside the team that are critical to their success. And in this context, when we look at the literature, there are three sets of activities that the literature describes as being part or being different kinds of boundary spanning, namely representation, coordination, and information search. So representation, the first activity, is where teams lobby up the corporate hierarchy in order to create favorable impressions among senior management. And this is important because when they can gauge the attention or gain the attention from senior management for positive project outcomes, it will help them establish a more positive reputation for their team, obtain legitimacy from senior management, and maybe even commitment in the form of financial resources that can make it easier for the project team to realize their project goals in the future. The second set of activities are referred to as coordination activities, and these include cross-boundary strategizing, planning, and evaluation activities that are necessary to occur for the project team to ensure that they can deliver their goals on time, effectively, efficiently, and with inherent flexibility and innovativeness. So coordination, we all know, is critical for delegation, and just to make sure that all the members of the team and all the other parts of the organization that we need to connect with are on the same page to realize our goals. Information search activities, the third set of activities, is about scouting the external environment for relevant knowledge, information, and expertise that can help the team identify opportunities, threats, and trends in the broader environments. So picture a team that is trying to design a product for a particular consumer segment. They may reach out to the marketing department to learn about consumer trends pertaining to this segment to be able to optimize their design process. So the challenge we were faced with is, okay, from the literature, from the theory, we understand that boundary spanning can come in different ways, in different types of activities, but how are we going to take all the different teams that exist in the context of this ESM platform and take all of the data that they've generated and identify these three processes effectively and efficiently? So we decided that a natural language processing approach was the best way for us to go and to develop our own machine learning algorithm where we could distinguish between these three activities. So in order to do so, we had to, of course, collect all of the different written content from teams within the organization. And in the context of the Jive platform, there are 4 different types of written content. So there are blog posts, there are discussion boards, there are documents that can be uploaded, and there are ideas that can be generated as a distinctive content category. And so what we did is that we collected all of that content. We then hired a set of graduate students and trained them using the theory and examples of these 3 activities. And we asked them to code a subset of all the data manually, about 14%. Now, of course, if we have terrible coding, then it's garbage in, garbage out. So then our algorithm would not be very good. So we first had to assess that the manual coding process was of high reliability. And our inter-rater reliability showed that this was the case, that there was about 98% agreement among the coders with respect to the classification of the content. And we could then use it to create our algorithm. Now, I don't want to, for the sake of time, I don't want to go through the process of the algorithm creation, but it should suffice to say that the resulting algorithm had an accuracy of 86.2%. So it was 86.2% accurate in classifying content of the platform as belonging to each of these 3 categories or another category that we had. So how would the results from such an approach look like? So essentially what we get is that we get a breakdown of all of the different written content within the platform according to these 3 activities, or as I mentioned, an other category. So we see that about 1/3 of all the posts were unrelated or did not involve a type of resource sharing or boundary spanning, but 2/3 of content did indeed involve one of the 3 boundary spanning activities. And you see that from the activities, representation was the least popular. So for representation, you can see that this was an example of a post that was categorized by the algorithm as representation. And and it says, here's a great video showing the work of our team in Vodafone's new workplace. So this was really about representing outward to the rest of the organization the success that the team had booked. The second most dominant category, about 20% of all the exchanges between teams, consisted of coordination posts. And here you see an example of a coordination post. Okay, CDC folks, the cancellation of the Innovation Center meeting threw us a little curveball. Here's the revised planning. So it's all about this strategizing and planning collectively. And finally, by far the most dominant boundary spanning activity was information search, which accounted for about 35% of all the content, so more than 1/3 of the posts. And they're usually in the form of questions, right? Asking for knowledge or information from outside the team. Has anyone worked on an innovation center that they could share? Now, in and of itself, this overview gave an answer to senior management question, right? Like, can this platform be used for boundary spanning, and to what extent, and what are the different types of boundary spanning that people engage in? But what we wanted to do is not just be able to classify the activities, but also potentially identify characteristics of the teams that would help us to predict or account for the likelihood with which they would successfully engage in these activities. And in this context specifically, we looked at 3 different types of diversity from the team, because the literature emphasizes that team diversity is an important antecedent to boundary spanning and knowledge sharing. And we also looked at this aspect of group visibility that I highlighted at the start of the presentation, because this is such a distinctive affordance of the platform. So we wanted to see if open groups, groups that anyone in the organization can see and engage with, versus secret groups that are hidden from the rest of the organization, perform different kinds of activities. So the first thing we found is that indeed, when groups are open, they are more likely to engage in representation activities, whereas when groups are closed, they're much more likely to engage in coordination and information search activities. And we can likely explain this from the fact that coordination and information search activities often will involve confidential information about clients or other third parties, but also tend to be more vulnerable activities, right? Where a team has to admit that maybe they lag behind schedule, as you saw in the example post that I gave on the previous slide, or maybe they have to admit that they're not aware of a certain area of knowledge that is critical to their project. So being able to do so in closed spaces where people can selectively interact with those sets of people in the organization that they have identified as relevant might give a safer space for these activities to occur. With respect to the diversity measures, we found that geographic diversity, which is the extent to which the team consists of people belonging to different geographic locations, had a positive effect for the ability of teams to reach out to get relevant knowledge and information. And we found that hierarchical diversity, so the extent to which teams span across different levels or hierarchical layers in the organization, had a positive effect on coordination activities and representation activities. But we also found that functional diversity had no impact at all, which in and of itself is an interesting finding because it's often a characteristic of teams that is emphasized in the team literature as being a critical driver of team success. So that was it for helping out to figure out the second strategic objective. Moving on to the third objective, so the collaborate, which was all about fostering innovation and creativity through social media. Again, the question was, how does this platform contribute to collaborative co-creation? Before sharing our results, I wanted to share a little bit of theoretical background that I think is quite fascinating when we look at the literature on innovation and creativity. So in the literature on innovation, there are actually two sets of competing theories of what results in breakthrough ideas. And we often call this the random variation model or evolutionary model versus the creative synthesis or dialectical model. And the first model, the random variation model, posits that breakthrough ideas are likely to occur when teams try to maximize their diversity. And they can maximize diversity in two ways: by creating teams that are cross-functional, so that represent people from different functional departments in the organization, but they can also maximize the heterogeneity of their perspectives and their inputs by focusing their attention not so much on interacting with other team members, but on interacting with people outside of the team. So on branching out and creating external connections. So the idea is that this diversity stemming from the composition of the team, as well as the external connections that the team focuses on, will drive innovation. On the flip side, in more recent years, Susan Harvey, who did a lot of research at Pixar Studios, found that breakthrough ideas really emerge in a different fashion, where teams focus a lot of time on creating very dense relationships among themselves and engaging intensively with each other and with the task at hand, allowing for equality of participation by all members of the team. And it's this shared focus on the task at hand that really helps to drive innovation. Now, in most situations, we might say, okay, this data set that we have 800 teams, we have tons of creative discussions. It's a great opportunity to see which one of these models is wrong or right. But we posited that maybe instead of asking which one is the correct model, maybe both sets of models could be true in reality. And we find that different types of groups create different types of creative processes, which in turn result in different types of creative outputs. And indeed, if we look at the literature on idea generation, we see that there are different types of creative outputs. And popularly, we refer to these as sometimes incremental or radical. But a classification that I prefer is this classification that was provided by Tsukas in an article in Organization Science in 2009, where he says that creativity can come about through combination and expansion, or through reframing. So with combination and expansion, what we do is that we create new ideas or new products, new solutions by combining existing concepts in new ways or expanding existing concepts from one context to a different context. So think, for instance, of the voice dictation Siri, which was originally developed for the US military and then was used by Apple to apply it in a consumer product. So for creative reframing, on the other hand, we see that the breakthrough ideas or the creativity doesn't stem from existing ideas, but starts with sort of taking a step back and taking a critical view at the problem definition and seeing if by challenging the problem definition, a new perspective of the problem and as a result, a new perspective of the result or the solution can come about. And this, according to the literature, often happens through the use of metaphors. So we set out to explore if maybe these two different models of innovation, so this evolutionary model, which emphasizes the importance of maximizing diversity, will lead to combination and expansion, which would be in line with what the literature tells us. And this creative synthesis model that emphasizes these closed within group interactions and equality will result in this type of creative reframing. Again, we used the same type of process. So we collected all of the content from all of the different project teams. We trained graduate students to classify a subset of this content manually as the training sample for the algorithm. And then we built the algorithm in order to classify the data and in order to be able to generate the dependent variable. And similar to the boundary spanning, of course, first of all, we got sort of a classification of content according to these types. And this in and of itself would provide an answer to the question of senior management, right? To what extent does creativity happen in the platform? And we see that across the two types of creativity, about 35% of all content contains elements of idea generation, but we see that combination and expansion is much more likely to occur. So 21% of these creative conversations, are a combination and expansion, and only 14% are reframing types. And I've just highlighted a couple keywords to show that this is really in line, what the algorithm identified really is in line with the theory. So we see that combination expansion, some example quotes were about modification, about applying techniques from one context to a different context. And for reframing, we see that key keywords in many of the posts were things like reinventing ourselves, alternative perspectives, thinking about alternative future states, etc. Now, again, we wanted to take this a step further to test these theoretical models, as I said. And interestingly enough, we did indeed find that combination and expansion types of creativity are much higher in groups that are open, so that are visible to the entire organization, and groups that show two characteristics, or the interaction of two other characteristics, namely high functional diversity, so consisting of members from different departments, and high connectedness or interactions with people outside of the team. So when groups have these two characteristics together, you can see that the level of combination and expansion that they generate really skyrockets. The second set of findings for reframing showed really the opposite pattern, right? So we found that reframing is much higher in secret groups. And here we found a very different interaction pattern, namely that for groups to engage in reframing, they had to have high levels of equal participation among the members of the team and very dense social connectedness between the members of the team. And again, when both of these characteristics were high, groups were extremely successful at engaging in reframing types of creativity. Now, what are the strategic implications of this? Initially or intuitively, we might be prone to think that reframing is somehow better. At least to me, it always sounds a lot more exciting than combination and expansion. But we know from existing literature that both sets of creative output generates performance benefits for organizations, but different types of performance benefits. So companies that tend to focus on these sort of incremental improvements to existing products or solutions tend to outperform the radical innovators in terms of profitability and cash flow, whereas on the other side, companies focusing on reframing tend to establish entire new markets and therewith perform much better in terms of market share. But I think the most important strategic implication from this is that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to innovation. So whereas a lot of the industry press makes us believe that in order for teams to be creative, we have to maximize diversity, and diversity is a critical driver of creativity, we see that this, yes, is true, but really for a specific subset of creativity, namely creativity focused on combining or expanding existing ideas in novel ways. And in this context, we see that open groups that are functionally diverse and maximize diversity by connecting to many different people outside of the team are most successful. But if we want to engage in this other type of innovation where we're radically rethinking our problem statements and coming up with drastically new solutions, we need very different types of teams that tend to be shielded from the rest of the organization. And maybe that's why many organizations have started to experiment with like idea incubators and other types of tactics that allow these teams to be relatively shielded and protected from the more institutional or bureaucratic mechanisms of the organization. So now we have all these very rich insights, right? We started from theory, we figured out ways to measure these 3 strategic objectives, but how can we translate these into visualizations or into a dashboard that could be used by managers in order to keep track of how the community is performing and evolving in their real time? So in the next slides, what I want to do is I want to just give you a brief overview of the pages that we built for each of these strategic objectives. So for the Connect, again, this was about the organization wanting to keep a pulse on perceptions of employees towards the organization. And in the early stages of our research, when we just started collaborating with Toolkit, we used the interviews as a proxy, but for the dashboard, we needed something more sophisticated. So in this context, what we did is really we assessed 2 different types of content. So first of all, we built a topic-oriented sentiment classifier, and I'll shortly explain why this topic-oriented part is really important. But we also created sort of a ratio of social to work-related content. So in this page of the dashboard, we visualize the extent or the amount of content that's more social conversations among colleagues versus work-related content. And the reason this is important, and this is how it links to the topic-oriented part of the sentiment classifier, is because we felt that if we assess the sentiment of employees towards the company, it shouldn't take into consideration sentiment expressed in social posts. To illustrate, say that someone goes out for dinner at a new restaurant in Grand Rapids where the company is headquartered, and the person posts a review of the restaurant on the ESM platform and said, "My dinner was terrible, customer service was awful," then this negative sentiment obviously shouldn't translate into our sentiment classifier, indicating that the sentiment towards Toolkit is bad. So it was important to first be able to classify the extent to which content was related to the organization, projects in the organization, products of the organization, before associating it with sentiment. A couple of other use cases of why this is relevant is for the topic-oriented part. One thing that it allows senior management to do is to zoom in on particular topics or keywords and be able to monitor the sentiment surrounding this topic. And this can be very useful following a major organizational change. For instance, a new CEO has joined the company. The organization can zoom in on those conversations mentioning the CEO in order to be able to see how the sentiment looks like, specifically with respect to this topic. Another reason why we felt that this ratio of social to work-related content is important is we hope that in future extensions of this platform, we can identify instances in which social conversations become the starting point for new work-related collaborations. Oftentimes, we may find ourselves at the water cooler or the coffee machine. Before COVID, now it would have to be a Zoom call, but where we connect with colleagues, we briefly talk about how our weekend was or something fun, and through our conversation, we identify that we have a shared interest or a complementary area of expertise expertise, and we decide that it might be a good idea to work together. So can we identify those instances in the social media platform where conversations start out being mostly social, but then evolve into work-related projects? For the second page, so this page, we try to visualize these three different types of boundary spanning. Remember the representation, coordination, and information search. But in addition, we also want to provide an extension to this page in the future. In and of itself, this offers the answer to the question that Steelcase had, right? Is the platform being used for knowledge sharing and other types of research sharing, and to what extent? So yes, we visualize. And as you can see, we visualize this by geographic location as well as across different timelines. And I'll show you a more zoomed in version of that momentarily. But another extension of the platform that we foresee for the future is that our research revealed that successful projects display very different patterns of boundary spanning activities than unsuccessful projects. Specifically, as you can see in this chart, successful projects typically start out with information search to collect all the relevant information that is needed for the project to begin, prerequisites, etc. Then proceed through two stages that are predominantly focused on coordinating, delegating tasks, planning, making sure everyone is aligned with the project timeline. And finally, upon successfully completing the project, the team then represents out to the rest of the organization the success or the results that it has achieved. But on the flip side, we see that for unsuccessful projects, they start out with a little bit of representation, which is odd because they haven't accomplished anything yet that they can represent out. And then they continue with three stages of information search, which actually might help us identify why these teams fail, right? Because either they don't possess the knowledge they need internally, and that's why they're continue to reach out to others for knowledge, information, and expertise, or they're just struggling to get to the point where they actually start working on their activities. And the reason I think this is important is because in the future, we could extend the dashboard in such a way that we don't just visualize these patterns, but we visualize them by team so that managers can identify teams that are likely to fail early on by seeing resource sharing patterns that are suboptimal, and managers could actually engage in corrective action in order to be able to align the team with their project goals to steer them towards the optimal behaviors. Very similarly for the collaboration page, so the third goal, right, about fostering creative collaboration. Again, we visualize these two different types of creative outputs, so the combination expansion versus the reframing. But again, here, beyond just answering Steelcase's basic question of to what extent is the platform being used, we see similar opportunities where in the future we could extend the dashboard with opportunities for managers to monitor the extent to which team dynamics and team characteristics are in line with these different creative goals based on our research that it really requires vastly different types of teams to engage in combination expansion versus reframing. So for instance, if a group is doing incremental improvements to an existing product, but it decides to be a secret group, managers could actually reach out and say, hey, you would be much better off being an open group so that you can branch out to others in the organization. In addition to these pages, we did add a couple of additions that I'll just go through very quickly, but the community and manager also asked us to be able to visualize different types of users. So she realized very quickly from managing the platform that there's really three categories of users. So the people that are more passive and browse for content, but don't really post anything. So the finders, people who ask questions, but don't actually share other content beyond asking questions. And then the people who share a lot of content. So we're really the champions of the platform that drive the content generation and the sharing of stories. And so what we also did is that we created one page for each of these categories. And we, together with the community manager, we identified all of the user behaviors that correspond to each of these three categories. And essentially our dashboard gives an overview of these behaviors, a breakdown of the category. For instance, here's the example of share, but the different activities that make up the category. And again, the manager can zoom in on how different regions perform vis-a-vis this category of activities, as well as how these activities evolve over time. I will skip over this part, but I already kind of referred to it. These are little animated GIFs, but we can allow users to filter the data in different ways, by region, by time frame, or by different departments. The time frame is the interesting one because people can, for instance, zoom in on a specific event that happened. So last year, Steelcase organized a 24-hour strategy jam where the entire organization, anyone in the organization, was allowed to promote ideas or for the future strategic agenda or strategic vision of the company. And we found that during this time, not only was there a huge peak in the amount of activities, but also departments and geographic locations that had traditionally been sort of silent were all of a sudden much more actively engaged with the platform. So it was interesting to observe how certain events can really change the dynamic of the platform. And we were able to do so by being able to zoom in on specific subsets of or specific time period. So just to summarize, our research resulted not just in the ability to measure these three very high-level strategic objectives, but also generate this custom-built platform that leverages custom-made semantic algorithms to assess not only these basic engagement behaviors like find, ask, share, but also the much more complex behaviors that the organization was interested in, namely the extent to which enterprise social media helps to build a shared culture, break down knowledge silos in the organization, and enable creative conversations. And you might wonder, well, okay, this is very specific to Steelcase, but I would like to argue that these are probably strategic objectives that are relevant for any organization operating in the global and digital economy, how to have a shared culture between all our employees, how to ensure that knowledge flows without barriers, and how to ensure that we can all create better products and solutions for our customers. So in terms of what the future entails, I would like to explore opportunities to collaborate with additional industry partners that might be interested in adapting the dashboard to their own organizational context. But I also foresee some other relevant extensions to this research. The first one is that I think it would be really cool if we could build in a recommender system within the platform that not just visualizes to users how they behave, but also provides them with recommendations to optimize their behaviors and use so they can more effectively reach their goals. And related to this, because our research revealed all these optimal configurations for teams in terms of different types of boundary spanning activities, different types of creative behaviors, could we design a team configuration toolkit where managers can go in and say, I want a team that will accomplish coordination goals very effectively. What does this team need to look like? So can we turn our predictive models into something that can be used by managers to build optimal teams for different purposes? And then finally, in the last months, I've had many conversations with senior executives and managers of various organizations, and I've come to learn that one of their primary challenges during this pandemic is how to keep a pulse on our employees, specifically when it comes to employee well-being. So are there opportunities for us to leverage these enterprise social media platforms because they're inherently designed to be social, to enable more meaningful workplace interactions that can contribute to employee well-being and help to avoid isolation in times of social distancing? And I just received a grant from HEC to study this, and again would welcome any interest from industry partners who want to collaborate in this context or might simply be interested in receiving a report from our findings to have some guidance at the end of that study. I'll skip that one. That was just a video to illustrate how I think this team configuration toolkit could look like. But moving forward, I would like, as I said, to reach out to you in the audience, especially industry representatives, to see if you see opportunities to collaborate on or support either additional research on possible interesting extensions to the dashboard, so maybe other types of behavioral dynamics that you think would be relevant for companies strategically to be able to measure and visualize, or even to explore opportunities to jointly commercialize this tool. So as you see, the platform is really an advanced prototype. It's fully functional, but I think there are great opportunities for us to commercialize this tool and make it available to a much wider range of organizations. As you can imagine, it will require many more companies than just Steelcase and much more data to continue to develop and optimize the dashboard to strengthen our organizational teams and hopefully change your companies and workplaces for the better when COVID is behind us. So thank you very much, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you. So very interesting presentation. It's impressive how much information can be hidden in the social media platforms. So we already have a couple of questions. So of course, to the attendees, feel free to ask any questions. So we ask it to Professor Van Osh. I can start with the first question. So it's about privacy. So how did you manage employee privacy during the project?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So what we did actually is that when we crawl the data from the platform, before we even get access to seeing it, all the employee identifiable information like names gets removed from the content that we have, the data that we have access to, and gets replaced with ID numbers from within the platform so that we are still able to link which employees belong to certain teams or certain departments, because that's critical to do more research, but we do not actually know who the particular employee is. So we cannot trace it back to the particular person. And also in terms of the findings, the agreement we have with the organization is that the results that we report, as you can also see from the dashboard, are always in aggregated form. So it always shows across locations or across different departments. So it's not specific, so that people are able to identify which person did what or did not do what. And we felt that this was necessary for us to protect employees from possible other consequences. And now it is true that if we want to move or envision a future where we could really give this power for a recommender system, it would have to be much more individualized. But that's why we have created different user logins where different users would have different rights. So the regular employee would only have the right to view his own behaviors and tasks and not that of other people. And a project manager could, for instance, only view tasks and activities of their own team. So I hope that helps to answer the question.
For example, I guess it would be there would be a way, for example, to I would say identify sometimes if there are some employees within the company, or I would say would be a way also to facilitate the migration of employees from one department to the other. But I guess that if data are somewhat anonymized, it's maybe somewhat a bit more difficult to identify which employee would be, more efficient in some other department than the one that's she's currently working in.
Definitely. Now, the thing is that each employee has a unique ID number that is already assigned in the enterprise social media platform. So that's associated with their unique credentials. And so we use that same ID number. So even if the person were to change positions or roles in the organization, move departments, that information would be updated automatically, but we still would not know who it is.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Another question. So have you used a similar approach or platform to help companies to adapt or to spotting AI or ML applications, technologies, for example?
To what kind of technology, sorry?
Machine learning or artificial intelligence, for example.
No, so we haven't. So this project has been very centered on Steelcase. So we haven't explored other applications of AI or machine learning in other organizations. But I was sort of hoping to use this presentation maybe as an opportunity for that. Because as I already spoke to in my last slide, I think there's a lot of future extensions that are possible, either from looking at the same behavioral dynamics, but adding sort of follow-up components to it, or maybe even identifying other types of behavioral activities, dynamics within the organization that could be relevant to measure from a strategic point of view. And I guess the good thing about the approach we took is that the inherent way that we designed the process is something that can be scalable or adapted to different contexts or different types of purposes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, so using this platform, so people in the company can share information. And is there a trend that is observed that's people, a relation between, what they do in a company, for example, people who are brokers in a company are also brokers in the real life?
Yeah, so this is actually a really good question, a very interesting question. We have explored it a little bit in one study where we linked it to other types of data from the organization to explore who is more likely to engage in these brokerage type of activities. Mm-hmm. And we do generally see that, for instance, representation activities are more likely to be conducted by project managers or team managers. And this makes sense because if you're essentially trying to negotiate for more support from senior management, you'll probably be able to add more weight to that discussion or that request if you are a manager versus just a general team member. But we found that anyone in the team really engaged in coordination and information search. And so these were not necessarily people that were designated to be brokers within the system. But I do think there's a great opportunity here. I mean, going back to sort of the early days of some of the social network research where they compared formal versus informal network structures of the organization, where there is opportunity to explore in more detail if people who engage in these activities are official boundary spanners, or if there's a big discrepancy between the formal and informal network. And in a way, we would hope that this discrepancy exists because the whole idea of this platform is that anyone can reach out and become a broker. But of course, there's limits to the amount of time we want people to spend in brokerage activities, because we also know from existing research that this can add so much cognitive burden that it actually undermines productivity. So having designated brokers might be better, or maybe it's better to have everyone do a little bit of brokerage so there's not too much cognitive burden on individuals.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. What are your recommendations for content analysis in organizations that use multiple platforms of communications and knowledge sharing, like Slack, Zoom, Dropbox, etc.?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So obviously looking at enterprise social media gives us sort of one aspect of the ecosystem, right? We know that companies use many different platforms and tools for communication. So subsets of these activities or even portions of projects might occur through different platforms. Now, because all the algorithms that we build are semantic algorithms, it actually doesn't matter where the content comes from. It just analyzes text. So if this text were to come from other communication platforms, or we could even use recorded Zoom meetings, and Zoom has the option of generating a transcript, but there are many tools available for us to turn written verbal communication into text-based transcripts. We could even analyze other types of communication. So inherently, because the algorithms, as I said, are semantic, we could apply them to any type of text-based data. It doesn't have to come from enterprise social media. It could come from any type of platform, and it could even come from platforms like Zoom, as long as we translate the spoken language into written language.
Perfect. Did you see any issues, for example, if people or employees communicate in different language, for example, in French, in English, in the same company?
That's a good question. So in our case, we did not have much of that. And we actually decided, because it was a very low percentage of posts, to focus only on English communications. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting because we have realized that different companies have very different requirements around enterprise social media platforms. So I remember back in the day when IBM created their own proprietary enterprise social media solution called Beehive, they made it a prerequisite that the communication on this platform was in English, so that the benefits of enterprise social media, namely that anyone can communicate with anyone else, would apply, because there would not be a language barrier to processing information. But obviously there's also reasons for companies not to do that, right? If people are much more comfortable expressing themselves in their own language, they should be able to do so. So in our case, yes, our algorithms are tailored toward the English language, and it would probably require a collaboration with some translation experts to make them work on other languages as well.
Thank you so much.
For example, if a company is interested to have access to such platform, are there some specific prerequisites that the company has to respect, has to have?
So I'm just not sure for this question if the question is focused on an enterprise social media platform or like our dashboard. So I'll just answer it for both, I guess. So enterprise social media, I mean, anyone can use these tools. Some companies have decided to build their own internally, but there are so many providers out there now that it's probably better to use existing tools out there. And the price ranges are very different. So a company doesn't have to be a prerequisite, but a company has to be willing to pay for these solutions, because they're usually go on like a per month, per user license basis. For the dashboards, as of now, as I said, we have developed it in collaboration with Steelcase. They've provided us with all the data access and a lot of the, of course, background thinking to be able to realize it. But we would be very happy to explore opportunities to collaborate with other organizations to see if we can adapt the dashboards to their context, considering that there are, of course, significant development resources required to do so.
Thank you. Any ethical issues that need to be considered for this technology, or this kind of technology?
So I guess this goes back a little bit to the first question. It was interesting that we recently at our annual conference, we had a keynote from Ben Schneiderman, which is probably one of the biggest scholars in the domain of human-computer interaction, and recently I started to look at human-algorithm interaction, and he made a statement where he said that invisible AI is unethical AI. So trying to hide AI from the user is really an unethical use of artificial intelligence. And to a large extent, I would agree with that, but I think that can also pose some challenges, right? That we know from very early research in organization science that when subjects know that they're being observed, they start changing their behaviors. So the inherent act of studying their behaviors changes the way that they interact. So having these platforms and crawling the content, the conversations from the platform and analyzing them is a great opportunity to realize how people really behave without having to rely on self-reports. But if this is something that we make too much in their face, let's say, if we make it very obvious that we are looking at the way they're interacting, their interaction patterns may inherently start changing. So I think this is a difficult question for future use. But I think as researchers, we do have an obligation to ensure that the way this data can be used is in ways that cannot harm the subjects of our study. So in our case, representing data in aggregated formats or ensuring that the visualizations that are generated can only be accessed by parties that can do good with it is an important ethical consideration.
Thank you so much.
I guess we have one last question. I guess you already answered that one. So it was about the use of more advanced AI tools, interactive tools within the creative team. So do you foresee a place for this kind of tools in the future? So I guess you already kind of answered that in your research outlook with maybe the use of recommender system or.
Exactly. So, so what I really would like to do in the future, and this is where I got the NSF Career Grant for, is to see if from having all these models, predictive models of what drives different forms of creativity, can we reverse engineer tools where we help teams? So as they are in the process of working on creating a new product or a new solution, can we give them the feedback they need to optimize their processes? So in near real time, can we identify aspects of either the way the team is composed, like the nature of diversity or the size of the team, or the way that they interact with each other or their environment, that we see might be hurdles or barriers to them being successful? And can we identify those and then nudge them to change their behaviors in ways that help them to be successful? Because ultimately, it's not just good for an organization for teams to be successful, but also for the team members, right? Because it ensures that they keep their job over time. So I think that is sort of where I see this going with AI in the future, not just to measure it and visualize all this content, but see if we can really assist users and empower the users to optimize their behaviors in ways that are beneficial to themselves and the organization.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we don't have any questions left. So I guess we are arriving at the end of this today's session. So we would like to thank you for participating in our webinar and giving this really interesting talk. So I think we had a really nice conversation. And so before we leave, I would just like to advertise about the next webinar, which will take place on March the 4th at 10 a.m. So it will be in English as well. And we will welcome a gorgeous warrior from True North Marine, Professor Michael Rungvist from Université Laval, and they will talk about the use of advanced analytics tools in the optimization of vessel routing on the ocean. So I just sent the link to the Eventbrite registration page. You also have a QR code to register. So Professor Van Osh, once again, thank you for your participation today. And thank you for all the attendees for attending today to our webinars. So we wish you a really nice afternoon and hope to see you for the next webinar on the March 4th.
Thank you. And thank you also for the interesting questions.
Thank
Have
you.
a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.